So welcome friends, I am Jean George, Assistant Professor from Department of Computer Applications, BSS College. Today we are going to discuss about modulation. So when we want to send a signal, we should prepare that signal in a proper way. For that, we should learn or we should know about the concept modulation. So we can check what is modulation. Modulation is the process of converting one form of signals into the another form of signal. That process is called modulation. So in the case of modulation, different types of definitions are there. In another way, we can say like that, the process of converting data into radio waves by adding information to an carrier signal is called modulation. So the first question is, what is carrier signal? Carrier signal is also a signal which have high or constant amplitude and constant frequency. That type of signals we can say these are carrier signal. So in the case of modulation, here you can see in the screen, first one is carrier signal. So it have proper high amplitude and constant amplitude. Also when we check the frequency, that also constant. Then in the second section we can see the red color, there is a information signal. So that information signal we are going to modulate. We are going to represent in carrier signal. So after that process, we will get a resultant signal that we represented in blue color. So here you can see with respect to the amplitude variation of information signal, we are changing the property of carrier signal. So already we know that we will get a information signal from the system or different types of sources. But in the case of carrier signal, we need a oscillator. Inside a modulator there will be a oscillator, that is a device which can generate carrier signal. So with respect to our need, we can give a proper configuration, then we can develop different types of strong carrier signal. So what is the use or need of modulation? Basically, the information signal are not compatible for direct data transmission because these signals are very weak. So we can't send this signal for long data transfer. So this is one of the main reason we need to modulate that information signal using a carrier signal. Second one is, without modulating, if you are sending a information signal, when it travels through the medium, there will be multiple signals in that medium. So in between this travel, there is a chance to get a small collision between different types of signals. So if the signal is weak, then there is a chance for missing data or there is a chance for some distortion in that signal. For avoiding that, we need to modulate the signal. Then another reason is, if you are sending a information signal, basically the wavelength of information signal will be high. So we need to use, or receiver end, they need to use a higher antenna or high length antenna to receive this information signal. But if you are sending the data after modulation, then comparatively this type of carrier signal have very small wavelength. So we can use a very small antenna to receive this type of information. So because of these reasons, we need to modulate a signal before transfer from this sender. So what are the advantages of modulations? The first one is, the range of communication has increased. we can send data to a long distance. Then second one is reception quality will improve. So the data quality, when we transfer the data, the received data quality in the destination side, they will get high quality data if you modulated using a proper good carrier signal. Next one is receiver can adjust bandwidth. So if you are modulating the signal, with respect to that, receiver can adjust the bandwidth and receive that signal. Then using modulation, we can multiplex different signal and we can send through a single channel. So we can efficiently use that channel through this multiplexing. So if you are modulating the signal, then that signal we can multiplex. Then the next advantage is no signal mixing occur, like in between the travel, if any collision is occur, then also this signal is strong, so it will not affect by any other noise signal. And the main advantage is the antenna size get reduced using this modulation. So these are the different types of advantages. Next, we are going to check which are the different types of modulation. Already in the previous session we have learned two types of signals are there, analog signal and digital signal. So for analog signal we need to use analog modulation, and for digital signal we need to use digital modulation. So in the case of analog signal, we can check which are the different types of analog modulations. First one is amplitude modulation, second one is frequency modulation, and third one is phase modulation. So there are three types of analog modulation methods. Then first one, when we check about amplitude modulation, it is a process in that it varies the instantaneous amplitude of carrier signal with respect to the instantaneous amplitude of information signal. So information signal is varying its amplitude in different time period. So with respect to that, we are changing that carrier signal's properties. In that way we are getting, or we are making a resultant signal. That process we can say amplitude modulation. One application of amplitude modulation is AM radio communication. Now we can check what are the advantage of amplitude modulation. It is very easy to implement and it is the very simplest type of modulation, and the hardware design of both transmitter and receiver is very simple. The receiver used amplitude modulation is very cheap. So comparatively cost is also less. So these are the main advantage of amplitude modulation. When we check about disadvantages, we can say it's not a power efficient technique. It is not a power efficient technique, because for this amplitude modulation we need to use a bulk amount of power and required very high bandwidth, like highest audio frequency, near about higher audio frequency bandwidth we need to use. Then it is susceptible to noise. That means there is a chance to affect noise in a specific percentage, in a limited percentage, but in the case of amplitude modulation very easily you can detect or notice that noise. So these are the disadvantage of amplitude modulation. And the second type of modulation is frequency modulation. It is also called as FM. Amplitude modulation is called as AM, frequency modulation is called as FM. So in the case of frequency modulation, we are encoding the information in a carrier wave by varying the instantaneous frequency of that wave. For example, here you can see when there is a carrier wave and information signal is there, carrier wave is represented using green color and information wave represented using red color. So, when we check these two signals and also when we analyze the resultant signal in blue color, when we analyze it, we can see when the amplitude, here you can see when the amplitude is decreasing, that means in negative level, so the frequency of resultant signal is decreasing. But at the same time, when the amplitude increasing, in that place the frequency of carrier wave is increasing. So, in this way we are changing the property, especially frequency of that carrier wave and making a new set signal or new signal, that is called modulated signal, then we are sending that signal. So, this process is called as frequency modulation. In frequency modulation, first of all we can check what are the applications of frequency modulation. In the case of FM radio broadcasting, we can use frequency modulation, then telemetry, sound synthesis, seismic prospecting, radar communication, magnetic tape recording system, some video transmission. In all these applications we can use frequency modulation technique. The main advantage of this frequency modulation is it do not receive any channel noise, because channel noise, it can avoid or remove channel noise. The same time, the main disadvantage is the circuit which we are making for frequency modulation is very complicated when it compared with the amplitude modulation. The circuit is very complex, but there is no chance to get a noise in the data signal. We are discussing about pulse modulation. Pulse modulation is a technique. In this, we are varying the pulse of carrier signal with respect to the information signal. So, in this also we are using the same carrier signal and information signal, but when you analyze the resultant signal, that resultant signal is little bit different. Here you can see when the phase change in information signal, you can see there is a phase change in carrier signal. For example, this is a information signal, red one is a information signal. When the information signal change from positive to negative, then the carrier signal change its phase by adding 180 degree. So, here you can see this is the phase change in carrier signal. In the same way, when the information signal change from negative to positive, then again in the resultant signal there is a phase change by adding 180 degree. So, in that way, whenever the change of information signal from negative to positive and positive to negative, the same time in the carrier signal they are adding 180 degree and change its phase. So, this type of property changes making in carrier signal, and we are representing our information signal in that carrier. This method or this process is called phase modulation. In the case of phase modulation, the main applications are Wi-Fi communication, GSM communication and satellite telecommunication. These are the different applications of phase modulation. The main advantage is in this we can use radio waves to transfer the data. Also, it will not receive any channel noise. These are the main advantages, and disadvantage is In the case of pulse modulation, modulation and demodulation consist of a complicated circuit than amplitude modulation and frequency modulation. So, this is the complex circuit than the AM and FM. That is the main disadvantage in the case of pulse modulation. Other than that, each one, when we analyze or compare, we can see each one doing different types of applications. In the case of pulse modulation, worldwide we are using this method for internet communication. So, in this session we have discussed about what is modulation, what is carrier signal, what is the need of modulation, and what are the advantage of modulation. Also we discuss about different types of modulation like analog modulation and digital modulation. In the case of analog modulation, three types of modulation methods are there: amplitude modulation, frequency modulation and phase modulation. So, in the next section we will discuss about different types of digital modulation. Thank you.